group that was well slept maintained a kilo of extra muscle and lost a kilo of extra fat, as opposed to the 5.5 hour group. Hey guys, welcome to the RMH project. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of sleep when it comes to fat loss. Okay, if you haven't been to this channel before, welcome. My name is Ryan. I'm an ex-NRL player, natural bodybuilder, and online coach. And this channel is all about getting jacked. Okay, so we're going to get into the episode now. The talking points of this episode is we're going to talk about a well-known study that looked at the effects of sleep deprivation on the individual's body composition when in a calorie deficit. Okay, so something that I'm sure will interest you guys as potentially you're on a fat loss journey. You want to make sure that you're retaining as much muscle as possible, and we want to look at how sleep affects that. We're going to look at the real life implications from this study. So what does it actually mean for us? And then if inevitably we do have a poor night's sleep, you know, we're not all perfect. We're definitely going to have poor sleep from time to time. How do we minimize that as best we can? And then just some tips on how to improve sleep overall. Okay. Now, let's look at this study. So the study was done on 10 individuals. It was a 14-day with a washout period and a 14-day. Okay, so technically 28 days in total. Now, doesn't really seem all that important. It's only 10 people. It's only for 28 days. What are we really going to find out from this? But I will say the advantage of this study is how well it was controlled. So all the 10 people for the 28 days actually lived in the lab. Okay, so they slept there, they ate there, all their movement was accounted for. So it was well controlled, which is really cool. And then they had 2 different sleep conditions. Okay, so they had an 8.5 hour group, and then they had a 5.5 hour group. So they did this for 14 days, had a washout period, and then they switched and did the other. Okay, so they're their own control. So it's not as if they just ran an 8.5 hour and a 5.5 hour and just looked at the results, even though there's going to be genetic differences. They did their groups, switched, and then did the same thing so that they control for the genetic differences between people, which is really cool. Their calorie deficit was 90% of their metabolic rate, which is pretty severe. It's a decent deficit. When you look at our overall energy expenditure, metabolic rate usually accounts for about 60 to 70%. So it's 90% of that. So it is a severe deficit, and which you will see in the results of how much weight they actually lost in this time period. And then, as I said, they lived there, so food was all given to them. So they had the exact same meals, even doesn't matter whether 8.5 hours, 5.5 hours, even when they switched over, had the exact same meals. Their sleep was accounted for, so they actually slept for the time period that I meant to sleep for. And then they also tracked their activity as well. And obviously they had the washout period there. So what actually happened? What happened? Who cares about the study design, right? We want to see the results. The results were both groups lost the same amount of weight, which makes sense. They're in the same deficit. Doesn't matter whether they're 5.5 hours, 8.5 hours in the same deficit. So they lost the same amount of weight, but it was the difference in the body composition. Okay. So the 8.5 hours, so the well slept group, they maintained an extra kilo of muscle mass, or roughly an extra kilo of muscle mass, and lost a kilo of fat. Okay. So though each group lost roughly 3 kilos, the group that was well slept maintained a kilo of extra muscle and lost a kilo of extra fat, as opposed to the 5.5 hour group, which is very significant, even though obviously they didn't have a resistance training program or anything like that. But it just, more shows how important sleep is, especially when in a calorie deficit. They also looked at hormonal changes. So they measured things like adrenaline, also ghrelin as well. They measured a whole host of different things, but these are the 2 things that really stood out for me. So adrenaline is sort of associated with sort of how much NEAT you get throughout the day. So like animation, moving hands, willingness to want to get up and go for a walk and be active. And then ghrelin is our hunger hormone. So how hungry, how much cravings we have and stuff like that. So adrenaline was lower in the sleep deprivation group, and the ghrelin was higher in the sleep deprivation group. So what does that mean? What does this mean in the real world? Okay, so the real life implications of this, from what I'm taking from the adrenaline being lower in the sleep deprivation group, probably going to be less likely that in the real world they're going to move as much. Their step count will probably be a little bit lower, willingness to want to go train is probably going to be lower as well, because activity was accounted for in this study. I feel like in the real world, the chances of people getting off the couch and going to do things is probably going to be less. Okay, and other studies I looked at as well. So there's a meta-analysis that looked at the training performance of someone who had a poor night's sleep. And they showed that there was a 3% decrease in strength for someone who had a poor night's sleep, which is interesting as well, because in the real life world, obviously we'd be doing resistance training to make sure we maintain as much muscle as we can. But if we have a poor night's sleep, that resistance training is not going to be as effective. So potentially we might not be able to maintain as much muscle as we like. And then also we'll probably have increased hunger and cravings. So although in this study, the food was given to the participants, in the real world, that's not how it works. So snacking is probably going to be increased. So therefore, potentially the calories are going to be increased. As I said, the food was given to them, so they had to set calories. Whereas in the real world, you walk past the supermarket, chocolate bar staring at you, you've had a poor night's sleep, chance of you grabbing that chocolate bar is going to be a little bit higher than if you're well slept, okay? Now, obviously, there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of doom and gloom when I'm talking about a poor night's sleep, but I do want to stress that this was over a 14-day period, okay? So it's not just because you have 1 or 2 poor night's sleeps that muscle's going to melt off your body, you're going to be ravenous, your training's going to go to shit. I'm definitely not saying that. I'm saying if you are chronically underslept, you could probably expect maybe similar results to this, or say if, classic example, people sleep really well during the week, going to work and stuff like that, and then a couple of benders on the weekend, poor night's sleep, out with friends and stuff like that. That can, if done over a chronic long period, potentially that could start to trickle into the results that we're seeing from these studies, okay? Now, inevitably, poor night's sleep is going to happen. Now, what can we do to try and minimize the effects of these poor night's sleeps? Okay, so acknowledging that cravings is going to be higher in these days. Just acknowledge it. It is what it is, okay? Try to do the best with it. Try to make sure that we're having whole foods, make sure we're getting a lot of protein, make sure we're getting a lot of fiber, making sure that they're having proper meals, okay? So snacking is going to increase. So if we can make sure that the meals high in protein, high in fiber, got a good whole food source, so we're getting quite a lot of volume in these meals as well. Anything that we can do to make us more satiated, so the risk of snacking in between the next meal is going to be decreased. And just understanding that, hey, this is just only for a certain period of time. I'm feeling snacky, I'm feeling cravey because I had a poor night's sleep, okay? Be mindful of caffeine consumption on that next day. I know it's tempting, you're tired, work needs to be done, just have a few more extra cups of coffee will get you through the day, right? But we also want to make sure that we're not prolonging this sleep deprivation and that the next night's sleep is as best as we can make it. So by having a whole heap of caffeine and then not being able to sleep properly for the next night, we're just prolonging these effects. So try to nip it in the bud, okay? Understand this day, yes, energy is going to be low. Yes, craving is going to be high. Get through it, try and have a good night's sleep, move on to the next day, I think is the best way to approach it. So that 9-hour window, pre-bedtime, try and eliminate all caffeine if you can. And then training earlier in the day. So that same study that I talked about where they showed that people had a 3% decrease in strength also showed that earlier in the day was actually less of a decrease, and if you waited later in the day, it was actually more of a decrease. So for a potential scenario where this might happen, say if you got woken up early for some reason, you couldn't go back to sleep, potentially going and doing your training session pre-work is probably a good idea, because potentially the strength might not be, the decrease in strength, might not be as much as if we did it later in the day. Plus, generally people, if they train later in the day, they might have a pre-workout later in the day. So that's caffeine consumption eliminated as well there. So if you get that session done early in the morning, not only is it probably going to be better, but also we'll be able to unwind into the evening to make sure that we can have the best possible sleep that following night, all right? Now, how to improve sleep in general, okay? So optimizing circadian rhythm, what does that mean? All that means is there's a few different things that you can potentially do. So being exposed to morning sunlight, okay, exercising in the morning, a bit of cold exposure in the morning as well could potentially help set that circadian rhythm. So when it comes to nighttime, you're actually that little bit more tired and are more inclined to go to bed. Create a good bedtime routine. So reducing all lights, so reducing overhead lights, and maybe a lamp in the corner, maybe some candles. Also trying to reduce screen time. This is something that I'm terrible at. I'm definitely trying to get better at, is trying to reduce screen time before bed. Too busy scrolling, I get it, but has shown to help with sleep, and especially the cycles within sleep actually improve if you're staying off your phone pre-bed. Managing body temperature as well. So when we go to bed, our body has to decrease in temperature by about 1 to 3 degrees. Okay. So the ways we can do this, we can make a cool bedroom. Okay. So whether you have aircon, fan, or whatever the case may be. And we can also have a hot shower. So sounds pretty weird. Why would you have a hot shower if you're trying to be cool? But what happens is a overcompensation effect. So when you have a hot shower, your body is trying to cool itself when in the hot shower. So when you get out, it's still trying to cool itself. So therefore, your body temperature actually drops. Okay, it's the same reason why you would exercise in the morning or potentially have cold exposure in the morning, because if you jump in a cold shower, your body's trying to heat itself up. So when you get out, it's still trying to heat itself up. So therefore, you have a higher body temperature. So we're just trying to follow that circadian body temperature throughout the day by using external tools like cold exposure, heat exposure. So when you wake up in the morning, generally your temperature is a little bit higher, your body temperature, and then as you go to bed, it drops off and is a little bit lower. So we're just trying to sort of manipulate that as best we can. And then additional factors, reducing stress, as we spoke about before, reducing caffeine in that 9 hours before bed, avoiding heavy meals, so not having those bigger meals. Obviously, I'm sure people would have done this before, having a big meal before you go to bed and it's just sitting in your stomach, find it hard to sleep. Reduce the amount of water that you're drinking pre-bed as well, so we can minimize how many times you need to get up and go to the toilet. Investing in comfortable bedding sounds a little bit weird, but trust me, if you get some premium cotton sheets, you will thank me. They are the best things ever. Minimizing noise, so trying to create that cave-like environment, so where it's cold, where it's dark, and also where we're trying to minimize noise. If you're maybe potentially live on a busy street or something like that, you could introduce a bit of white noise. So I listen to, it's called the Sleep podcast on Spotify. Just sort of has those like nature noises in the back, and they go for roughly an hour. I just chuck that on, set the timer for 45 minutes, and generally I'm out like a light before that turns off. And then just being consistent with your regular sleep schedule. So I feel like a lot of people have like a set wake up time, but not a set bedtime. And I'd say actually having a set bedtime is more important than having a wake up time, just to train your body to, hey, when it's 9 o'clock, whatever, just picking a random time. When it's 9 o'clock, it's bedtime. It's time for us to shut it down. It's time for you to go to sleep. And so just training your body that between 9 and 6, that's the sleep time. Try not to differentiate from that too much, or even on the weekends, try not to go to bed at 12 and wake up at 10. You're effectively putting yourself into jet lag by doing that. So try and reduce that discrepancy from when it comes to the weekend, as opposed to what bedtime we do and what time we wake up during the week. Okay, so hope this has helped, guys. As always, do those good things, like, subscribe, share. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.